Imagine your commander hands you the keys to a fleet of just 13 ships and tells you to stop an armada of over 130 warships dead in its tracks. Most men would have quietly accepted defeat before the battle even began. But Admiral Yi Sun-sin was not most men. On the morning of October 26, 1597, he sailed his tiny Korean fleet into one of the narrowest, most treacherous channels on the Korean peninsula and waited. What happened next would become one of the most stunning military upsets in the entire history of naval warfare. A story so extraordinary that even the Japanese admirals who came after him would one day bow their heads in respect. To truly understand what Yi accomplished that day, you have to go back and understand just how desperate the situation was for Korea. The year was 1592, when Japan, under the iron ambition of warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi, launched a full-scale invasion of the Korean peninsula. Hideyoshi's ultimate goal was not just Korea, he wanted China, and Korea was simply the bridge he intended to walk across to get there. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops poured onto Korean soil, and within weeks, they had taken the capital. The situation looked absolutely hopeless from the very start, except for one thing. One man stood between Japan and complete domination of the region, and his name was Admiral Yi Sun-sin. In those early years of the war, Yi was already performing miracles. He organized a naval force that stopped Japanese supply lines cold, winning battle after battle along the Korean coast with creative tactics and superior seamanship. His fleet used innovative warships, including the Turtle Ship, a vessel with an armored hull shaped to deflect arrows and equipped with devastating cannon fire. The Japanese found that every time their navy tried to advance, Yi was there to meet them with calculated aggression. He won engagement after engagement, and his reputation grew to legendary proportions both inside Korea and across the sea in Japan. But greatness often attracts enemies close to home as well as far away. Jealous political rivals and scheming court officials eventually succeeded in what Japan's entire navy could not accomplish on its own. They had Yi stripped of his command, falsely accused of treason, tortured, and demoted all the way down to the rank of a common foot soldier. The navy he had built with such incredible care, trained so meticulously over years of hard-fought experience, was handed over to another commander named Won Gyun. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Won Gyun, without Yi's strategic brilliance guiding the fleet, sailed the entire Korean navy into a trap at the Battle of Myeongnyang in August 1597. The Japanese were waiting. They ambushed the Korean fleet with a force of over 500 ships, closing in for brutal hand-to-hand combat that denied the Koreans any chance to use their superior cannon fire. The Joseon Navy was effectively annihilated. Won Gyun was killed. Of the entire fleet, only 13 warships survived, saved by an officer who fled early enough to preserve them. With Japan's second invasion now underway, and the Korean Navy reduced to almost nothing, King Seonjo sent a letter to Yi, who had been watching the disaster unfold in humiliation as a common soldier. The king told him there was no point rebuilding the navy, that it was finished, and that Yi should simply dissolve whatever remained and join the ground forces. Yi's response became one of the most famous lines in Korean military history. He wrote back to his king with calm, unflinching conviction. As long as he still breathed, the enemy would not find the Western Sea safe. He had 12 ships. He would find a way. Yi spent the next weeks doing something no ordinary man would have done under those circumstances. He reconnoitered the coastline meticulously, studying every channel, every current, every shift in the tides. He was looking for a place where 13 ships could stand against over 100. He found it at the Myeongnyang Strait, a channel so narrow it measured only about 320 yards across at its tightest point. The currents through that channel were extraordinary, running at nearly 10 knots and reversing direction completely every 3 hours. Yi understood immediately what that meant. In a narrow space where ships could only enter in small numbers at a time, the Japanese could never deploy their full numerical advantage. And when the tide reversed, any ship caught in the middle of that channel would be at the mercy of chaos. He gathered what he had: 13 warships, roughly 1,500 sailors and marines, determination that no amount of political punishment had managed to extinguish, and a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. He positioned his fleet at the northern end of the strait and waited for the Japanese to commit themselves to the crossing. He even sent a fast scout ship near the Japanese naval base to lure their fleet out, making them think he was trying to run. The Japanese took the bait entirely, deploying their enormous fleet to chase down what they assumed were the pathetic, terrified remnants of a broken navy. On the morning of October 26, 1597, Yi's scouts reported the Japanese fleet approaching. The numbers were staggering. At least 133 warships formed the combat vanguard, with hundreds of additional logistical support vessels trailing behind. Against them, 13 Korean ships anchored and waiting. The Japanese commander, Kurushima Michifusa, was a seasoned and aggressive naval officer who had no reason to fear what he was sailing toward. He led his ships into the strait with confidence. What happened to the Japanese fleet in those narrow waters was a masterclass in using geography as a weapon. The powerful currents made precise maneuvering nearly impossible. Ships that attempted to advance in formation found themselves pushed sideways, exposed to withering cannon fire from Yi's ships, which held their positions with the deliberate calm of men who had made peace with the moment. The Korean cannon were significantly more effective at range than anything the Japanese had. And in a confined channel where closing the distance to board the enemy was nearly impossible, the Japanese advantage in hand-to-hand fighters meant almost nothing. Yi's sailors poured fire into ship after ship as they struggled through the churning water. Yi fought from the front. His own flagship advanced on the Japanese vanguard before any other Korean ship dared to move. And for a terrifying stretch of time, his vessel fought the entire leading Japanese force, essentially alone. His crew reportedly hesitated, overwhelmed by what they were looking at. Yi stood exposed on deck, refusing to flinch, ordering the drummers to beat and his men to shout, creating a wall of sound and fury that masked just how few ships he actually had. Officers who watched him that day later described it as something they could not fully explain. A man who simply refused to let reality defeat him before the battle even decided its outcome. Then the tide shifted, literally. The strong current that had been flowing one way suddenly reversed, exactly as Yi had predicted and planned. Japanese ships that had already entered the channel found themselves fighting not just Korean cannon fire, but the full force of the Myeongnyang Strait, pulling them backward and sideways, crashing them into one another. The Japanese flagship was overwhelmed, and its commander, Kurushima, was killed. His body eventually recovered from the water. The sight of their admiral's death rippled through the Japanese fleet like a shockwave. At least 30 Japanese warships were confirmed sunk or destroyed. Hundreds of Japanese sailors and marines were killed or wounded, and Yi Sun-sin did not lose a single ship. The aftermath of that day changed the entire course of the war. Japan's naval advance up the western coast of Korea was completely stopped. With their supply lines threatened and their naval superiority suddenly in serious question, the Japanese army's advance toward the Korean capital stalled. The Ming government of China, which had been keeping its own fleet in harbor out of caution, watched what happened at Myeongnyang and decided it was safe enough to send naval reinforcements to Yi's side. The balance of the war had shifted in an afternoon. Yi rebuilt his fleet over the months that followed, turning 13 ships back into a fighting force capable of confronting Japan's navy on far more even terms. He would go on to fight his final battle at Noryang in November of 1598, where a combined Korean and Chinese fleet pursued a retreating Japanese armada. Yi was struck by enemy fire during that battle and mortally wounded. As he lay dying, he gave his last instruction: "Tell no one of my death until the battle is over." He did not want his death to cost his men their courage in the final moments of a war he had fought his entire adult life to win. He was given exactly the kind of ending that a man like him deserved, going out on his feet, still fighting, still thinking of his people first. Japanese Admiral Togo Heihachiro, who became famous in his own right for destroying the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, was once compared to Yi Sun-sin in admiration. His response is one of the more remarkable things any military commander has ever said about another. He replied that next to Yi, he himself was nothing more than a petty officer. That is the measure of what Yi Sun-sin accomplished. A man who was imprisoned and stripped of everything by his own government, who was handed 13 ships against an armada of over 100, who stood on the deck of his own flagship while it fought alone against an entire fleet, and who walked away without losing a single vessel. History is full of unlikely heroes, but very few of them changed the fate of an entire nation with nothing more than 13 ships and an absolute refusal to accept the impossible.